Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
If you own a dental practice and are looking for additional locations, or you're an associate doctor looking at practice ownership at some point in the future, this episode is for you. And I'll start off by saying that there's never been a better time to acquire a dental practice in the United States. And this applies to both associates going out on their own and doctors looking for additional locations, established practitioners. I could go even further and say that there's never been a better time economically to be a dentist, again, at least in the U.S. Now, I've covered the why on this in previous episodes. Most recently, I did a deep dive on this about 15 episodes ago on episode 141, The State of the Dental Industry. And the most relevant statistic to all of this that I'll revisit briefly in this episode has to do with the current demographics in the dental industry itself. Once you see these, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. So if a new practice is in the cards, whether it's your first office or your second, third, or more, what exactly would be involved and what should you be looking for now? What's good versus bad? What are some of the important but often overlooked points when buying a practice? Well, that's what I want to talk about in this week's episode. My name is Jeff Bloomberg and I'm your host. And I think the best place to start is by backing up my claim as to why there's never been a better time to acquire a practice. I mean, long story short, and to put it simply, based on dentist demographics alone in the U.S., the number of practices that are projected to come up for sale in the next 3 to 5 years is over 20,000, which is higher than I can ever recall in the past. And I've been in the industry for about 30 years. And to give you, the exactly how this works, let me give you some basic data here. So I'll start with the first, which is, and I'll have copies of this, a link to the slides for this on the episode webpage. But let's start with practice ownership in the United States currently. So since 2005 to now, this is from the ADA Health Policy Institute. Back in 2005, 84.7% of dentists owned a practice. So, let's just, I'm going to round numbers off. So I'm not, 84.7265. 85% of doctors owned a practice back in 2005. That number is down now to 73%. We also have another factor, which is practice ownership has dropped amongst younger doctors. I think you see where I'm getting with this. Most of the practices that are owned by doctors who've been practicing for a while. But to give you just a flavor here, back in 2005, doctors who were under 30 owned 25% of them owned a practice. That number is down below 10% now. It's at 9.5%. Doctors who are 30 to 34 back in 2005, 55% of them owned a practice. That number is now down to 34%. And, the numbers go as you get into it's an every 10-year age bracket, right? So it's under 30, 30 to 34. Then it goes 35 to 44 and 45 to 54 and so on. As you get, doctors getting older, a higher percentage of them own practices. So the majority of the practices in the United States, or a large portion of them, are owned by doctors who are in higher age brackets rather than, 30 to 35 or 30 or younger. And to give you a basic idea, right now as it stands, there's approximately 201,000, a little bit more than that, dentists in the United States. Of that, about 147,000 own practices. That 73% number. But of the 147,000 doctors that own a dental practice in the United States, 43% of them are over 55. I'll say that again. So we got 201,000 dentists, 147,000 own dental practices. Of that 147,000, over 60,000, close to 63,000, or 43%, are over 55 years of age. Now, why is that a big deal? Obviously, I'm not under 30, and I'm not having an ageism thing here. What I'm saying is that if you're 55 or you're 60 or you're 58, you're not going to practice as long as somebody who's 29. I mean, that's just a reality. If you'd asked me when I was 29 how much longer I'd be working, it would be a lot longer than I would tell you now. That's just a fact of life. After a certain point, you're going to want to cut back, sell, retire, and so on. And to that end, the average dentist's retirement age in the United States is about 68 years old. Okay, the last statistic we have on this from the ADA Health Policy Institute was back in 2021, but the average dentist retires at around 68. So get this picture I'm painting. You have less dentists who are younger owning practices. A large portion of the practices, 43% of them for that matter, are owned by doctors who are 55 years and older, and the average retirement age for dentists in the United States is 68. So now, this is kind of an interesting little statistics. Again, this is all from the ADA Health Policy Institute. I'll put the slides up on the episode webpage, but you can check them out for yourself. They have something called the outflow or exit rate over a 5-year period. Okay, which basically means, if you go from now, which is 2024 to 2029, if you take doctors in a certain age bracket, how many of those will still be practicing in 2029? They have an attrition rate. Okay, so what's the attrition rate or exit rate, as they call it in this survey? We have 3 age brackets. We have up to 54, 55 to 64, and 65 and over. So if I were to take 100 doctors who are anywhere from, 20s, late 20s to 54 years of age, and, here they are, 100 doctors, and now what percentage of those doctors will have retired or left the profession 5 years from now? Well, that number would be anywhere from 3 to 4%. So we'd still be left with, 96 to 97 dentists at the end of 5 years if you took a bunch of dentists up to 54 years of age. How does that change when you get to 55 to 64? If you had 100 doctors, ages 55 to 64, now, 5 years from now, how many of those would no longer be practicing? Close to 20. So if you had 100, you'd end up with 80 left after 5 years. The other 20 would have either retired, left the profession, etc. Now let's take the 65 and over bracket. If you have 100 doctors 65 and over, how many will still be practicing and haven't retired or left the profession 5 years from now? Well, the drop-off rate is almost 55%. And technically, it's 54.5, but I told you I was going to avoid the points. So if you had 100 doctors 65 and over, 5 years later, only 45 of them are still practicing. So there's a large drop-off rate when you hit this 55 and over bracket. 55 to 64, it's about 20%. 65 and over, it's 55%. And going back to this practice ownership issue, where 43% of the practices in the U.S. are owned by doctors 55 and over, to give you an idea, close to 20% of the practices in the U.S. are owned by doctors 65 and over. Like total is almost 27,000 offices are owned by doctors 65 and over. Based on the numbers I just gave you, 55% of those doctors will have retired, sold, or left the profession 5 years from now. In that 55 to 64 bracket, that's close to 37,000 practices. And again, we'd have 20% of those dropping off. Again, I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but basically, if we do the numbers on all of this and we were to project using the ADA's numbers based on this, we're projecting just from demographics alone over the next 3 to 5 years that 21,846 dental practices could end up for sale. That's a lot of practices, okay? Almost 22,000 offices will be for sale in the next 3 to 5 years, just based on demographics alone. This does not include drop-off with doctors who are under 55, okay? So that's a lot of offices. Now, your first thought might be, because corporate's making a big push. I was just looking recently at some of the how you'll have when somebody starts a new company or there's some big acquisition, you'll get these press releases. There's a site called PR Web, and what that does is it bounces it all over the internet. But basically, a lot of private equity is getting into the dental field now, investing in DSOs and things like this. So you might think, well, DSOs are going to buy up those 21,000 or 22,000 offices. And that's not true. DSOs are not looking for smaller practices, which I'll get into here in a second. The primary DSO target is a larger office, or they're just building a brand new office from scratch. They're not buying, the doctor who's practicing 30 years and his practice is now doing 300 or 400 a year and he's looking at retiring or wanting to sell. That's not a DSO target. Okay. So DSOs are not going to absorb all these offices. They're either going to be bought by somebody or they're going to close. And that somebody could be you, whether it's your second or third or fourth location, or if you're an associate doctor, you're starting off with office number 1. So just these numbers alone sort of answer a big question that, I get asked by especially an associate if they're, wanting to start out. Should I buy a practice or should I start from scratch and build up the way I want it from the beginning? Well, just based on these numbers alone, my initial advice would be try to find a practice that's already there. It's a lot easier to take over a practice that currently exists and has been established than to start and build out from scratch. That said, equipment is a heck of a lot cheaper than it's ever been before. There's lots of ways to equip an office without a lot of expense involved, but it isn't going to be super cheap. Whereas if you're buying a practice that's already established, especially a place that's been there for 20, 30 years, you at least have at least some business going. You're not starting completely from scratch, and you should be able to hit the ground running. We've done both with our clients. We've had clients who've started scratch and done established. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the episode. But just based on the fact that 22,000 offices are going to be for sale, I think there's plenty of opportunities for purchase. And it's really not that big of a deal. I know it's very easy to get into the frame of mind. I want a glass here, and I want smoked glass in the consult room that turns on when I press a button, and I want this special, this and that, whatever, and I want to spend $1 bazillion on everything to make it look like the ideal, super futuristic and cool office. You might think that you have to have that in order to be successful. I'm going to tell you, you don't. Now, you do need the proper equipment and instruments and supplies and materials. And of course, you need all of that. But you don't have to have, super fancy everything. It needs to be clean and in good repair and look nice. It can't be a place that makes you uncomfortable to be in, but it doesn't have to be like you walked into an office that cost $3 million to build out. So if you pick up an old office, a lot of the things you do to take over that office don't have to cost a lot of money. Chairs can be reupholstered if they're decent. Paint doesn't cost very much. There's a lot of things you can do to make the front desk look better and, things of that nature. It really isn't that difficult to update things and, buy a scanner, and it's not that difficult. So my initial advice would be to get a practice that's currently established. And I'm sort of lumping together two concepts here. I'm talking to both doctors who are currently in practice 1, 2, or 3. They have an office and are looking for additional location. As well as associate doctors who have been thinking buying a practice is on their radar. I'm talking to both of you, but obviously there's a couple of differences. The actual purchase of the practice, the actions you're going to be involved in are more or less the same. The advantages an established doctor is going to have is they already have established relationships for a lot of the things they're going to need in that second practice, with finance companies and suppliers and equipment, and, guys who do equipment. You're going to have all this, and an IT guy. Whereas, if you're an associate and you're doing this for the first time, you may not have all of those established, lines or people that you deal with. But the acquisition is relatively the same. There's also, if you're an associate and you're buying your first practice, you also don't have the headache of worrying about how that's going to affect, if you currently own a practice, how it's going to affect your main office. And usually that's the big consideration when I'm talking to a client who wants a second, third, fourth, or fifth location is let's make sure this doesn't mess up your main office, because I've seen that happen where, they buy the second office and it includes them working there a lot, and it starts to wreck the revenues of office 1, which was what was supporting the whole thing to begin with. And then it becomes problematic. So you don't want to do that. I've done episodes on this, by the way, several on, the do's and don'ts of getting a second location. If you own a practice and you're thinking second location, I would definitely listen to that before you buy. If you're an associate, there's a couple other things you could be looking at here when you're doing this. Obviously, if I own a practice and let's say I'm practicing in, New York City. Well, if I own a practice in New York City and I'm looking at getting a second location, I'm going to hope that second location is not too far away. I'm not going to go start a second location in Delaware. That's not something I can go to if something's going really wrong. Well, I can. It's just going to take me a couple hours in a car. That's not the ideal. I might be going a little bit upstate. I might be going to Long Island. I might be going to North Jersey or something like this. Something not too far away that's easier for me to control because I'm already anchored by office number 1, right? Now, if I'm an associate doctor and I'm looking at a second location, one little bug I'm going to plant in your ear, especially if you're flexible on where you're willing to practice, is, You can be successful in any location. I want to make this clear because I don't want you to think that location is everything. I mean, it is for real estate ownership, but not necessarily for your business. Location isn't everything, but it can help. Okay, so if I have a practice and I'm right next to a large supermarket with a lot of foot traffic in a strip mall, that helps because I have a lot of people seeing my office all the time, especially a supermarket because I'm there the supermarket's open 7 days a week, right? Or I've seen it where, someone is in a strip mall and then a Starbucks opens up in the strip mall and their new patients go from 20 to 40. Just because of the foot traffic, people see the office, right? So in my opinion, that'd be better than being in a humongous high rise on the 33rd floor with 200 other dentists in the building with me. Now, does that mean if I'm in that humongous high rise with 200 dentists in the building with me, I can't be successful? Absolutely not. I can. It's just going to be a little bit easier if I don't have that scenario and I'm in the strip mall next to the big supermarket and my nearest competitor is 5 miles away. Okay? So location can help. It's not going to make or break your success, but it can help. And the reason I say this is if you're an associate and you're flexible in where you want to practice, and we've had this happen with new clients who are associates and they haven't decided where they're going to practice yet, is I would do a little bit of research, especially if you're flexible, because there are areas in the United States that are considered underserved areas, okay, especially rural areas. There's, and I'll put a link to this on the episode webpage. There's a website called ruralhealthinfo.org. And it's actually sponsored by the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy. Okay. So a government agency sponsors this website. And I put this link here. And what this link is health professional shortage areas, dental care by county. And it's from July of 2024. And it's basically shades of blue. Light blue means there's no shortage in the area of dentists. I think they're measuring dentists to population. I think that's the metric they're using. And the darker blue it gets, the whole county, if it's dark blue, the whole county is a shortage area. If it's sort of like medium blue, part of the county is a shortage area, and it has a whole map of the United States. And you'd be shocked. Like, let's say if you're in New York State, you go up a few counties and you're in an area that's got a huge dental shortage, or if you're in Virginia, you might be in one area like the DC area is not too bad, but you go a little bit to Southern Virginia or there's a huge shortage, or Illinois, Chicagoland area, not necessarily a shortage. You drop down to Southern Illinois, there's a ton of shortages. So if you're willing to be flexible with where you practice, and I'll tell you a story about this in a second, and you want to do some research and you want to do this right, you're willing to move, that isn't necessarily a bad idea to pick an area that maybe has a shortage and use that as your target area, do some research because, again, like I said, location isn't going to make or break your practice, but it will make it a lot easier. Just something to think with. I would just plant the bug in your ear. What it does is it opens up, a lot more possibilities. To that end, we had a couple of doctors, both associates, and they were this exact scenario. They came to us. They wanted to do some executive training and practice management training to make sure that they started off right. So they actually started with the MGE Power Program, which I'll put a link to on the episode webpage, before they purchased a practice. They were this is what they were going to do. So we helped them identify an area, which was an underserved area. And to give you an idea of the impact, now, obviously, this wasn't only because they were underserved and they marketed the place right and they did it right. They opened a scratch practice because there just really was no practice to purchase there. They had no choice. They opened a scratch practice and they did close to $300,000 in month 3. It's a husband and wife team. Okay. And they've held up those numbers or higher since. The point being is they were able to get in. There was a definite demand and a need for dentistry. Boom. They filled it. It made life easy. So if you're looking at that, if that's something that's maybe on your radar and you're an associate doctor, that might be something that you want to think about. Maybe pick an area that's rural or underserved to that end and jump over there. Okay. And, this just brings up a funny point because normally when an associate doctor comes to MGE, MGE was set up, we're a practice management training and coaching company. So the majority of the doctors we get in own a practice, one or more. Because it's a lot of staff training and this and that, as well as training for the doctor as an executive and case acceptance, etc. So when we do get associates, we'll get 2 types. We get some associate doctors that just want to learn to sell a bit better because it immediately affects their productivity. And then we have doctors who have the idea, look, I'm going to be starting a practice at some point in the future and I need guidance. But we've always catered to doctor owners. We've helped associates, but it's never been our main line of business, right? And we looked at this recently because, in my opinion, speaking of underserved areas, this is a very underserved area in the profession. There are a lot of associate doctors that are looking to go off on their own, but maybe they're just a bit concerned about how that's going to roll out. And to that end, this is my shameless plug of the episode. We've helped associate doctors do it as a part of the Power Program. And we know exactly how to do this. There's an exact step-by-step process you walk somebody through to take them from concept to actually in their practice and producing. And this is something we know, we know this really well. It's like falling off a log for us. We've just never packaged it as a program catered to an associate doctor. It was more of a thing we did if someone was on the Power Program. We now have a program for this. So if you were an associate doctor and the idea of practice ownership is on your radar, even if it's a year from now, we have a program for this. It's called the Practice Startup Program from Associate to Owner. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage if you want to find out more. It's a newer program, so I don't have a whole fancy landing page for it, but you can fill out a form. And what this is we will take you from concept, I would like to buy a practice, all the way through to you're in your practice now, the rudimentary setups are done, your staff know what they're doing, and you're now productive, the first few months in. So we'll take you from concept all the way through. Because there's a lot of different things, because I've seen it where someone will come here as an associate, they'll get trained, we go, okay, good, you want to do some more training? No, let me find a practice and I'll get back to you guys when I find one. Then they find one, and we weren't working with them in the interim. And they just got all kinds of messes stuck to them. They sold their they bought the practice, but they're still technically working under the seller's NPI because they don't have an NPI 2 because they don't have one. It's all kinds of goofy stuff, right? So they're working under the seller because of network issues. There's things that you want to address before you buy a practice, because when you're buying a practice, there's a lot of little steps, and this even happens to clients when they're buying a new office. There's checklists upon checklists upon checklists that we give these clients, because there's so many things you can mess up or you can forget. So I want to get into that a little bit as far as what you're looking for when you're buying an office. But let's start off with, what kind of office are you looking for? If we're looking for an existing practice, what does this office look like? Well, I kind of alluded to earlier, we're not looking for the big office. Now, look, you can do whatever you want. This is, I'm giving you what we have found to be successful. You obviously have to follow your own path. But if you're an associate doctor looking for your first office, or you're an established doctor looking for a second location, are you looking for a $2 million a year practice? I would tell you, heck no. I absolutely wouldn't do that. I'm going to start small and scale. Okay? That's what I want, whether it's a second location or I'm an associate starting out for my first time. Again, this assumes that I don't have to start from scratch because I'm in some, remote area that doesn't have an office. So what are you looking for? You're looking for a place has 3-4 chairs, hopefully plumb for a little more if that's possible. And if it has more chairs, that's fine, right? And it's, collecting maybe $500,000 or a little bit more, a little bit less per year. I'm not looking for the $900,000, $1 million a year office. You're looking for $400,000, $500,000, $600,000. Why? Because that's not going to cost a lot of money. When you start getting into higher numbers, the whole valuation process changes. This is one of the great things that, and I'm saying that sarcastically, DSOs have brought into the industry. The original valuation method for a dental practice. And this is just something to know when you're looking to buy even. Because again, I find a few people don't know this. The valuation methodology for a dental practice, like real thumbnail, was 70% of last year's collections. That was the simplicity of it. It might go down a little bit if the equipment is old and problematic, or there's some other, blemish on the practice. Or it might go up a little bit if the equipment's new or it has a cone beam or something like this. But you're generally trying to hover in that 70% range. All right. Now that DSOs are become more prevalent in the industry, they brought other business valuation methods to the table, which is a multiple of, you've probably heard the term of EBITDA. I'm not going to get into it. Let's just say, for lack of a better way of explaining it, and this isn't the exact definition, if someone's going to comment on it, EBITDA isn't that. Look, it's kind of like profit, okay? Let's just keep it simple. I'm not going to get into the whole EBITDA thing here. But basically, they're going to give you a multiple of EBITDA. That's how the DSOs are coming in. So you might have had a practice, let's say a practice doing $3 million a year, and you're making $1 million a year profit. All right? Well, back in the day, that $3 million a year practice, You'd buy, if you were buying it from somebody who was doing $3 million with $1 million in profit, you'd buy that practice for $2.1 million or 70% of $3 million. That's how it used to work. And the owner doctor might work there for a few months and then they retire and whatever. Well, now they're giving them a multiple of that profit or EBITDA. Okay. So they're giving them $5 million or $4 million. That's what the DSOs are giving them. So on a couple levels, there's a problem here. Number one, the average individual practitioner is going to have a problem rounding up $4 or $5 million, whereas a DSO or a private equity is not. Okay. And number two, in my opinion, that's overpaying for the practice. Generally speaking, the business valuation methodologies used by big companies, the reason why it really differs from the way that dental practices or any small business that's driven by the owner personality, okay, is, if the owner doctor is the face of the practice and they leave, that affects the practice far more severely than if no one knows who owns the practice. Okay, let me give you an example. Let's say I have a supermarket and it's called, I don't know, whatever, local market, whatever it's called. I own a supermarket. It's a pretty popular supermarket. No one knows that I own this supermarket. Maybe my picture's on a little wall somewhere, like near the management office. But nobody knows that I really own it. If someone comes along and buys that supermarket and I'm no longer present in the supermarket or owning the supermarket, that really doesn't affect the supermarket in any way. No one really cares because no one knew I owned it in the first place. Whereas if I'm a dentist and all the patients know me and I'm the main producer, owner, doctor, I might have had associates over the years, and you buy my practice and I leave, I'm taking some of the goodwill with me. No matter how much turnover I do to you, there is going to be a degree of attrition because I am very prevalent in that practice. So usually when you're buying a business like that where the owner looms large, you pay less for it because it's not like buying the supermarket. Unfortunately, that whole valuation method, like for the supermarket or the big business, has entered dentistry. So you're not looking for these big mega practices. You're not trying to break the bank when you buy a practice. You want to buy something cheap. It's going to cost you, if it's a $500,000 a year practice, it's going to cost you like $300,000 and change. And depending on how long the person's had it on the market, and other factors in the practice, you might even get it for below market value. I have clients that are getting a lot of practice for below market value. They're getting it for 50% of last year's collections or 60% of last year's collections. And they're walking away with, in my opinion, a really good deal. That's why I was saying there's a lot of these practices out there. They're not just the mega practices that are going to become DSO targets. So that's kind of backing up my statement. This is the best time to buy an office. I'm seeing it with MGE clients. The other thing too is if I'm buying a practice for $350,000 because it did $500,000 last year, and I'm going to need some working capital because I'm going to have to paint the place and reupholster chairs, maybe buy a new chair, and I need an iTero and whatever I need, right? If I'm going to do that, rounding up $350,000 isn't the end of the world. I can do that. In some cases, I've even seen it where the owner doctor that you're buying from will hold some of the paper. You don't even have to go the bank route. You'll give them $50,000 to $100,000 down, which you might just have, and then you pay them a certain amount per month. And I've seen plenty of people do this, so it's not completely out of the realm, but you're not having to round up millions of dollars to buy the practice. So now, what's the generalization of the process when you're getting into actual acquisition? So I'm going to go over, there's 10 basic steps that we walk our clients through. If it's a power client and they're looking, whether they're an associate who's just doing training on the power program and they want to buy a practice, or it's an MGE client who wants a second location, these are the generalized steps we walk them through. Obviously, I'm not going to go through the entire checklist because there's multiple checklists that we walk a client through when they purchase an office, different things they use. But these are sort of the broad strokes. And some of these steps, if you own a practice, will be familiar to you. If you don't, these might not be familiar to you. But I'll kind of run through some of the basics here because you'll find that some of these go missing, and that's usually what messes up a practice purchase. So the first area we start, and this, by the way, is what we're doing now on this newer program I mentioned for associate doctors when they're looking at buying an office. First thing you should do, like step one, is you want to conceive of what it is you are looking for. Like, okay, so you want a second office and you own a practice. Why? What is it we're looking for? If you're an associate, what is it that you're looking for here? What are the long-term goals? What's the direction of this practice going to be, right? How much do you want to spend? Like, what's your debt appetite or financial situation to figure out how much you're willing to spend? And, how would you get that money? Obviously, there's lots of solutions for that now. There's, B of A practice solutions a lot of our clients worked with, where they'll do 100% financing for startups. But even beyond getting financing, because that's not that difficult for a dentist, it's, how much do you really want to take on? What is your debt appetite? That's something you want to think with, as well as what am I looking to create here? And then it's a matter of deciding also, if you're in that associate position, where do I want to practice? You might need to do a little bit of research on this. If you look at that map that I put the link up for before, there's so many underserved areas. It's pretty wild. I mean, you might go, heck, I want to go to South Dakota. There's plenty of places there. Well, in that case, you're going to have some licensure considerations and whatnot. And even within every major metro area, within a couple of hours, there are underserved areas for the most part. So this is not very difficult to pick that area, but pick sort of like, where are we going? What's the long-term goals? And where do I want to practice, right? So then from there, I'm going to want to do some research. Like, take your time on this, okay? We're going to want to find some brokers, because this is another issue with practice brokers. We work with a few, and I know quite a few, but it's not like buying a house. If I want to buy a house, there's something called the MLS. We're all familiar with this. I think it stands for Multiple Listing Service. Every house in the United States, when it gets listed, goes on the MLS. So every realtor is aware that, if you're selling your house, that your house is for sale. Everybody knows, okay? And there's a bazillion sites it ends up on. When you're selling a dental practice, it really depends on who you list it with. There are certain cases where you list with a broker, and that broker has a terrible website and they don't promote it very well, and nobody knows that your practice is for sale. Or the hoops somebody has to jump through in order to find out that your practice for sale becomes prohibitive, or, obviously when you're selling your practice, if you don't want your staff to know you're selling your practice, well, you're not going to list all the details and the name of the practice. So there's a little bit more going on, and it's a lot more fragmented. So my advice would be, you might have a broker who represents you, but I wouldn't limit myself to talking to just one broker unless they find exactly what you want, because there may be a practice down the street you're not even aware of is for sale that you'd really love, and you just don't know. Okay. Then I'm going to want to do some research on the area. I'm going to want to look at patient demographics as well as dentist demographics. How many doctors are there? Because like I said, competition, you can rise above the competition and dominate. But if I'm one of 5 dentists in an area of 100,000 people, that would be great, right? One dentist for every 20,000 people versus one of 500 dentists in an area with 100,000 people, right? It's going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to want to look how many dentists are in the area, and then I'm going to want to look at demographics in the patient base, age, income, things of that nature, so I get a good feel as to where I'm going. Here we get into, again, where an existing practitioner may have some of these people on their team, whereas an associate doctor may not. Who are the people I'm going to want on my team as I start looking for an office? Obviously, I'm going to need a broker. I'm going to need an accountant. I'm going to need an attorney that I can reach, not just some attorney I'm going to eventually call, but have an established relationship with an attorney. And if I'm looking at going with a scratch practice, or even if I'm looking, I may have to get some equipment, I want to line with somebody who does equipment, right? I want an established person who does equipment on my team, whether that represents an equipment manufacturer. I might also have somebody who deals in supplies as well. And, this day and age too, there's a lot of people that you're going to need on your team that you may not have conceived of before, like an IT person and things like this. You don't need the IT person yet, but you might during due diligence. But you're going to want at least those people on your team. So then I start getting some listings from brokers, right? I'm getting some listings from brokers. So now I have to review these listings to see, before I jump in and actually go visit the practice, I have to look at, does this fit what I'm looking for? I might have to sign an NDA of some kind. And this is where, by the way, this is what we walk our clients through. We look at these listings with them. That's a good fit. That's a bad fit, etc. You're going to want to look through this to figure out, does this meet my basic criteria? Do I want to pursue this any further? And if it does, now I'm going to review the targets a little bit further. This is where I might actually go look at the practice with actual serious interests, okay, to see if this is something that I would want. And this is where we normally give our clients a checklist that they walk through to kind of, check off in the practice. They're not even into the purchase phase yet, but they're looking at getting some basic data together to see if this is a good acquisition target for them, right? And if you want, what I'll do also as a download here, I'll put our practice acquisition checklist. It's sort of like you can walk into a practice and it gets the basics there. On the episode webpage, you can download that as well if you want to check it out. But usually we'd have a client fill that out and then we would look at it. Then we're going to take a look at this practice and go, because here's the problem. Every practice that's for sale, if it's not a scratch office, which comes with its own challenges, has a different situation. Maybe you're going to an office that gets a lot of new patients, but the retention is terrible, in which case there's a lot of potential hygiene there. Or maybe the retention has been very good and it's got an already established hygiene department. Maybe they're not selling quadrant dentistry, for lack of a better term. There's lots of different scenarios that could be going on, which is going to determine the first steps you're going to take when you buy the practice, but that's all part of painting the scenario as to, how you're going to buy it when you get in, how you're going to start off. Okay. So then we'd obviously look at this with a client and go, okay, here's the potential for expansion. This is what we can see potentially for revenue-wise and whatnot. So let's say, again, if you've done this before, this is familiar to you, but let's say you haven't. What are you going to do next? You're going to give this seller a letter of intent, or your broker is going to put together a letter of intent for everybody to sign, or their broker is, or whomever. And basically, this is usually not super binding. I would still have my attorney look at it just to make sure. This is why you have the attorney on your team. Don't sign anything without the attorney looking at it. And basically, it states what your intent is with regards to buying the office, how much is going to be paid, and how long the due diligence period is supposed to be. It's usually not very binding. And to that end, buying a dental practice in most cases is not like buying a house. Some of these deals fall through the day of or 5 days before. A lot of them don't have earnest money that you put down and things like this. So now you're into the due diligence phase. You've targeted this office. You give them you've given them a letter of intent, and now you need either they're going to start drafting or your lawyer is going to start drafting an asset purchase agreement to buy this office, right? So now you're going to start doing your due diligence. And this is where, again, I see the biggest screw-ups are made, is with due diligence. There's a lot of things you should be doing due diligence for, and not just the financials. Some people limit it to just looking at the P&L and the tax returns. I mean, that's great. You can get it out because certain things really don't matter. The rent is obviously important. You need to know what the rent is going to be. But as far as payroll, you might not keep the same staff. And supplies, really, things like supplies and lab costs and things like this, you may not even use the same labs. But that's all dependent on productivity. What if you're not as productive as that person? So obviously those numbers are going to be smaller. So those financials are helpful for fixed cost purposes and whatnot. And obviously the person you're buying from probably doesn't have as much debt as you're going to have when you buy this office. So those numbers are important. But there's other pieces of due diligence you have to do that are critical, which is you need to go through the patient software and see what they actually have. Who's there. There's a whole bunch to this. We have a whole checklist for this. But you want to really take a look at what's the actual health of this practice. Of course, you're going to look at financials and whatnot. How many patients do they had? What's the hygiene program actually look like? Who's actually coming in? Things of that nature, like what's really going on. And then, depending on your plan with regards to staying in or getting out of network, that also has bearing on the due diligence. Right? What if you're buying a practice from somebody who's primarily Delta Premier and you can't get into Delta Premier? Well, that's, these all are things that you have to be thinking with. Okay. So this is where it helps to have somebody to look at it and kind of paint the scenario for you. You have to make sure you can transfer the lease. But then there's also, what I see get missed a lot is like a technology checklist. You go in there and you look at it and you go, maybe you don't know computers. This is where it might be good to have an IT person come in with you, or somebody who knows IT in a dental practice. And it seems like everything's cool, but then once you buy the place, you find out the server is a piece of junk, and the X-ray, the digital X-ray keeps crashing because the server's garbage, or you just installed voice over internet phones and it crashed your server. You don't know these things because nobody did a technology checklist, because that's part of it. There's certain pieces of technology you might have to change the day you take over, and certain things that might be nice to change later. Same thing goes with equipment. You want to be able to look at this equipment. And if you're a dentist, you should be able to look at a chair and see if it works. But to give you an example of this, I saw a client buy a practice. They brought somebody in from a dental supply company or an equipment company. They looked at the equipment. They said, yeah, this is pretty good. This is bad, whatever. They told them their chairs were fine. So they take over. And then apparently it turns out two of the chairs, like a larger patient had actually tipped the dental chair over. Like nobody knew about this beforehand and they had to replace the chairs. Chairs were old and they were terrible. And these are things you want to know before you buy the office, because I mean, you can get two chairs pretty cheap these days, but it's not super cheap. You're at least looking at around 20 grand, maybe a little bit less, but installed, it's going to be expensive. As well as the next thing you're going to want to look at as part of due diligence is the fee schedule. What fee schedule are they charging, right? And you have the whole in-network and out-of-network issue, but you want to look at the fee schedule and take a look at what are they charging patients in the area. Has that fee schedule been updated? Because that's something that you're going to want to take a look at, as well as the marketing. You want to look at the whole footprint of the practice before you actually buy it. There's nothing sadder than see somebody drop $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and then they regret the purchase afterward. And obviously you're still taking a jump. You're not going to know everything, but you want to know as much as you can. Then there's all the different things you have to establish. And look, someone might listen to this episode, and I don't know if I'm boring you to death with all this stuff, and you might go, Jeff, you forgot to mention blah. Obviously I did. I'm not going through everything. I'm just trying to give you the general flavor. You have corporate things you have to take a look at, insurances you're going to have to get, what type of company are you going to start? You're going to need the ability to process credit cards. You might need a new website. You're going to need something for payroll. You're going to need, there's all kinds of things you're going to need. Then the other thing you have to look at when you're buying this office is what's the transition going to be like? Is it being operated by an owner doctor now? And does that owner doctor plan on sticking around? If this is your second location, they might want to be the associate for you in there, in which case that might work out great. I've seen that work out great before. But if you're taking over the office and this person's retiring, that whole transition has to be planned. What are they going to do? How are they going to introduce you? Because we want that transition to be as smooth as possible. One thing I forgot to mention too, because this is probably the thing I hear the most on these transitions, as part of your due diligence, also look at the software and make sure you're happy with it. Some people go, I've never heard this software before and I'm stuck with it. Don't do that. Anyway, I've heard I get told some software names and I'm like, I've never heard this software before. There's a lot of things like this, having to do with MPI-2 numbers and things like this for your corporation. There's a lot of different stuff in making sure you're enrolled with finance companies. Tons and tons and tons of little things as you're leading up to the purchase. Now, there's a good and a bad side to this. If I'm going to buy a practice, and let's say I'm going to buy a practice using a PLLC, a professional LLC, okay? I'm going to need the LLC before I close on the practice, the PLLC formed. Now, if that practice purchase doesn't go through, because I've seen that happen, I'm going to be stuck with a PLLC that I can't use, right? Fine. You can either close it or you can rename it for the next practice that you acquire. It's not the end of the world, just things to think with, right? You then have the issue of they have staff there. Do you want to retain these staff? Do you not want to retain these staff? And then you have the whole marketing. I could go through all of this, the marketing ramp up, the final, affirming the closing date, making sure you got everything ironed out, etc., and whatnot. And then you actually get into your launch, right? And again, I could go through all of these steps, but obviously if you're thinking with it, you're thinking with, you reviewed the staff, then you have the marketing ramp up for when you start, but you don't want to spend the money on the marketing yet. To give you an example, let's say you want to send postcards out the second you take over this practice. But remember, in a lot of cases, dental practice sales can fall through the day of. So if you go out and print a bunch of postcards getting ready for when you take over this office and then the deal falls through, you've just dropped, I don't know, however much you've dropped on printing a bunch of postcards that are just going to end up in the garbage, right? So from a marketing perspective, because you're going to take all of this over the day that you close, you're going to get the website, you're going to get the social media, the Facebook page, the Instagram page, the TikTok page, etc., as part of your purchase. And you want to make sure you get all this the day that you purchase. So you make sure this is all listed. This should be in your asset purchase agreement. But I wouldn't do anything that cost me a bunch of money yet. Like I've seen people spend a bunch of money to develop a new website and then the practice deal falls through. I mean, that's kind of foolish, right? You're going to be okay with the old garbage website till your new website's done. Trust me, that practice has been there for a while. With the bad website, you'll live. So I would do my marketing stuff from a design perspective. I'd design as much as I could. I'd line up as much as I could, and that might cost me a couple $1,000. But I'm not going to spend tons of money printing and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. I'm going to wait till I close to do that, because until I close, that stuff is useless to me. I can always repurpose it for another practice, but not if I printed postcards, because that number and everything else is going to work. So once I close, right, I'm going to get in there. I'm going to get access to everything. I'm going to get any new purchases done that I needed. I'm going to have a launch meeting with the new staff. I'm going to have to get the payroll set up and the finances set up and all that kind of stuff. And then the most important point from there is, how do I launch and really get into a productive situation as quickly as possible? And I give you a couple of hints on this. I mean, the first thing is you want to make sure that if you're taking insurances or whatever, that you're set up to take them, right? You want to make sure that your software is workable. Even if you've got bad software that you're not happy with and you're going to be switching it, make sure you can at least use the stuff that's there when you get in there, okay? If you're going to need patient financing, make sure you're signed up for all of that ahead of time. Usually getting the ability to take credit cards is pretty easy. But then once you get in there, you want to make sure that you take command of the schedule. You want to make sure that everybody that's there knows exactly what it is that they're supposed to be doing, in order to, from their job or hat in the practice, right? And then you want to make sure, and again, this all is situational depending on the practice. In a lot of cases, when you're taking over an office from a doctor who's retiring, there's a ton of reactivation that needs to occur. The office may not have been as aggressive with treatment planning or presentation over the last few years. That has to change. So you're going to want your patient financing lined up. You're going to want to make sure that all of your marketing efforts are working in the sense that you have whoever's answering the phone is good at new patient conversion, so you don't lose these patients and thereby waste your marketing money. And obviously, if you're doing a scratch practice, there's a lot more steps to this because you're building out and things of that nature. But like I said, in most of these cases, I would suggest you grab an existing office. There's really no reason to get a scratch practice unless it's, an underserved area where, there just is no practice. But there's a lot to this. There is a lot to this. And like I said, what we do normally, if a client's on the MGE program, we'll walk them through all of these steps. We have checklists for all of this stuff. I wasn't going to read every checklist on the podcast. I think it would have driven you insane. And we do now have a program to help associate doctors go from concept to in the office. And we walk you through all of this stuff. We'll coach you through the whole thing to make sure that you can go from associate to owner. Anyway, I was a little bit all over the place with this, but I just wanted to reiterate this point. If practice ownership or additional practices are on your radar, now's the time to start looking. There's never been a better time to do this. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, you can email me at jeffb@mgeonline.com. And before you respond with, Jeff, you forgot this, remember, I wasn't going to get into it all. Look, I love feedback, but sometimes I'll have somebody, you forgot to mention this. And I'm like, yeah, just 30 minutes. Well, actually, I did more than 30 minutes this time. There's no way I was going to do it. But if you have questions, you can email me at jeffb@mgeonline.com. We'll put the link to it on the episode webpage. I also have that link for the associate to owner program that you can click, as well as the MGE Power program, as well as that practice acquisition checklist. If you want to check that out, you can download that as well. Anyway, folks, if you have any questions about MGE, you can reach us at 800-640-1140 or find us at mgeonline.com. I hope this helps. Have a great week, and we'll see you at the next episode.